I interviewed Windsor's mayor earlier today, and he tells me the bridge is complete. It's ready to open, but recently President Donald Trump stated publicly that he wants the U.S. to get more out of this international border crossing. However, Windsor's mayor says Canada has fulfilled every obligation since day one and even funded the entire construction of the bridge.
Donald Trump just turned one of North America's biggest infrastructure projects into another political standoff with Canada. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is finished. The cables are up, the customs plazas are built. Trucks could be moving across the Detroit River soon. Instead, the bridge is sitting in limbo, while Washington pushes for new concessions from Ottawa after construction is already complete. And now, a project that was supposed to symbolize U.S.-Canada partnership is starting to send the opposite message to investors, manufacturers, and even America's closest allies. Because if the United States can reopen negotiations after Canada already paid nearly $7 billion to build the bridge, what exactly is considered a stable agreement anymore? The Gordie Howe International Bridge connects Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, one of the most important trade corridors in North America. The project was first approved years ago after long political battles surrounding border congestion, post-9/11 security concerns, and the growing importance of cross-border auto manufacturing between Ontario and the U.S. Midwest. Construction officially began in 2018. Canada agreed to finance the entire bridge project, including major infrastructure on the American side, such as customs facilities and highway connections into Interstate 75. For years, the bridge was promoted as a symbol of cooperation between two economies deeply tied together through manufacturing and trade. Then, the politics changed. Earlier this year, President Trump publicly suggested the bridge should remain closed unless the United States received greater compensation and broader concessions from Canada. Reports tied to the negotiations included discussions around U.S. alcohol access in Canada, ownership interests connected to the bridge, and complaints about Canadian trade practices. That immediately triggered backlash north of the border. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens publicly said Canada should reject any bad deal tied to opening the bridge, even if it meant waiting longer. And what made the situation awkward was that the bridge itself was already complete. The roads were paved, the pylons were standing, the crossings were physically ready. Yet the opening became trapped inside a much larger political fight between Washington and Ottawa. For years, the Gordie Howe Bridge carried a very specific image. It represented North America functioning normally. Canadian steel, American labor, Ontario manufacturing, Detroit auto plants, trucks crossing the border every hour carrying parts back and forth through tightly synchronized supply chains. That was the sales pitch. But over the past few months, the symbolism flipped completely. Now the bridge increasingly looks like proof that even long-proofed infrastructure projects between allies can suddenly become political leverage under Trump. And that creates a real business problem beyond this one bridge, because investors pay attention to consistency. The Gordie Howe project already had the permits. Construction was completed. Canada fulfilled the financing commitments. Michigan workers helped build major portions of the U.S. side. Yet after all of that, Washington is still reopening negotiations tied to unrelated disputes. That introduces a new kind of uncertainty into the Canada-U.S. economic relationship, especially for industries that depend on decades-long infrastructure planning, auto manufacturing, energy transmission, critical minerals, logistics hubs, cross-border industrial projects. All of those sectors rely on one assumption: agreements made today will still hold years later. The bridge dispute suddenly puts that assumption into question. What makes this story politically interesting is that Canada is not reacting with panic. The tone coming from Ottawa and Windsor has actually been surprisingly controlled. Drew Dilkens openly admitted nobody wants the bridge open more than Windsor does, but he also said Canada should not go on bent knee just to satisfy last-minute American demands. That line landed strongly inside Canada. Because politically, the bridge dispute is reinforcing a narrative Mark Carney's government has already been building for months. Canada needs to reduce its vulnerability to sudden policy swings coming out of Washington. and Trump may be helping that argument more than anyone else. Carney has spent much of the past year pushing export diversification strategies, stronger trade relationships with Asia and Europe, new industrial infrastructure projects, and expanded economic corridors outside direct U.S. dependence. Normally, those arguments can sound theoretical. The bridge dispute suddenly makes them concrete, because Canadians are now watching a fully completed trade corridor sit idle while Washington pushes new conditions after the fact. That changes public perception. And internationally, the optics are not ideal for the United States either, especially when Canada can now tell investors, we financed the project, completed the project, honored the agreements, and the uncertainty still came from Washington. Then came the complication Trump probably did not want. The backlash started growing inside Michigan, too. This matters because the Detroit-Windsor corridor handles massive amounts of trade tied directly to the American auto sector. Manufacturers across Michigan rely on predictable border movement for parts, engines, transmissions, and industrial components flowing between factories. The bridge was designed to improve redundancy and reduce congestion across one of the busiest commercial crossings on the continent. Instead, uncertainty around the opening is adding more instability to a region already dealing with tariff pressure and rising production costs. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer recently said she expects the bridge to open very soon, signaling frustration with the ongoing situation. Business groups in Detroit have also continued supporting the bridge publicly because the economic logic is straightforward. Smoother crossings mean lower costs, faster shipping, and less risk for manufacturers. And the financial exposure for the United States is not small. Industry estimates tied to Trump's broader tariff strategy already suggest American automakers could face more than $100 billion in additional costs, while some imported vehicle costs have risen by over $8,000 per unit. The Gordie Howe Bridge was supposed to help offset some of that pressure by improving freight efficiency and reducing delays at one of North America's most critical trade corridors. Instead, Detroit manufacturers are now watching a completed bridge sit idle while uncertainty continues building around future border operations. For companies already struggling with supply chain timing, even small crossing disruptions can translate into millions of dollars in lost productivity and higher logistics costs over time. And politically, that creates an uncomfortable contradiction for Trump, because while the White House frames the bridge dispute as leverage against Canada, many of the practical consequences are landing inside the American Midwest itself. Detroit factories still need the trade flow. Michigan logistics companies still need the infrastructure. American consumers still absorb the costs when supply chains become less efficient.
Right now, the Gordie Howe Bridge is standing fully completed across the Detroit River, while negotiations continue behind closed doors. Canada says it already upheld its side of the agreement. The White House insists broader issues still need to be resolved. Michigan businesses want the crossing operational, and investors are watching how one of North America's biggest infrastructure partnerships turned into another geopolitical dispute. The longer this continues, the more the bridge stops looking like a symbol of continental cooperation and starts looking like a warning about political risk inside the United States itself. And that may end up being the real backfire in this story. Not just delayed traffic across a bridge, but growing doubts about whether America under Trump is still the predictable economic partner Canada built this project for in the first place.
Right now, we have a kind of lawlessness in the U.S. Approach. It's very personalistic. The president just does what he wants to do. There's no congressional role. There's no claim to law.
Economist Jeffrey Sachs captured the mood perfectly when he said the United States is no longer practicing trade policy at all. It is wielding economic warfare. And in this moment, Canada has shown it refuses to be the target. Trump's latest attempt to squeeze Canada has backfired. His threat of a 100% tariff strike was meant to intimidate Ottawa and pull Prime Minister Mark Carney back into line. Instead, it revealed how little leverage Washington now holds. What the White House expected would corner Canada has only pushed Carney to stand firmer, speak louder, and publicly reject the entire premise of U.S. pressure.
I meant what I said in Davos. It was clear it was a broader set of issues, that Canada was the first country to understand the change in U.S. trade policy that he had initiated, And we're responding to that. We're responding positively by building partnerships abroad. We're responding positively by building at home.
The confrontation began when President Trump warned that the United States would impose sweeping 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Ottawa continued deepening its ties with China and other global partners. It was classic Trump: maximum pressure first, negotiation later, and chaos as a feature rather than a bug. But the situation shifted dramatically once reports emerged from Washington claiming Carney had privately walked back his Davos remarks during a phone call with the president. The implication was clear. Carney spoke boldly abroad but softened once Trump confronted him directly. Then the Prime Minister stepped in front of the cameras in Ottawa and shut that narrative down in a single sentence. He said he meant exactly what he stated in Davos, that he repeated the same message to Trump, and that Canada will continue expanding its partnerships across multiple continents. There was no retreat, no hesitation, and no apology. This moment landed hard in Washington. Carney's remarks at Davos had received a standing ovation, while Trump's own appearance drew a cooler response. Former Canadian ambassador to the United States David McNaughton said the contrast likely irritated the president more than the policy disagreements themselves. The symbolism was unmistakable. Canada's message resonated, America's did not. From that point on, the narrative of a walkback collapsed. The Prime Minister's words were measured but firm, signaling to both allies and markets that Canada would not be pressured off its chosen path.
Canada's response marks a departure from previous trade clashes, where Ottawa tended to absorb the hit and work quietly behind the scenes. This time, Carney chose clarity instead of caution. He framed the global environment as a fractured landscape, where traditional rules no longer hold, and where middle powers must build resilience through diversification. Canada's 12 new agreements across 4 continents, many of them negotiated in the past 6 months, reflect this shift in strategy. The country is no longer positioning itself as an appendage to the U.S. economy, but as a global actor with its own priorities. When Carney reminded Trump of this during their call, he wasn't provoking the United States, he was defining a new Canadian posture. The message was simple: Canada will work with partners who share its interests, and those choices will not be dictated by tariff threats.
On paper, a tariff of that scale should have frightened Ottawa. The U.S. remains Canada's largest trading partner, and any disruption has real costs. But 3 realities made the threat ring hollow. The first is interdependence. The U.S. relies heavily on Canadian energy, minerals, electricity, vehicle components, and agricultural products. Former Ambassador McNaughton pointed out that American companies and state governments are constantly pursuing commercial partnerships in Canada. Tariffs of this magnitude would immediately harm American manufacturing and supply chains. Trump may issue threats freely, but implementing them is another matter entirely. The second is timing. The president is entering a politically sensitive period leading into the midterms. Financial markets have reacted poorly to past escalations, and his administration knows it. The Greenland tariff saga last year demonstrated how quickly economic turbulence forces the White House to step back from extreme positions. And the third is alignment. Canada is not isolated. Carney's speech in Davos, Asian partners, and a growing coalition of middle-sized economies that share the view that global trade can no longer revolve around U.S. unpredictability. This informal network gives Canada a buffer it did not have in earlier disputes. Put together, these factors meant Trump's tariff threats started as bluster and ended as a miscalculation. What the White House also underestimated is how deeply Canada is embedded in sectors the U.S. cannot easily replace. American refineries are engineered for Canadian heavy crude. U.S. battery manufacturers rely on Canadian critical minerals, and cross-border electricity grids deliver reliable baseload power to several northern states. These are not commodities that can be swapped overnight. Any severe tariff would have triggered political backlash inside the U.S. itself, from governors, automakers, utilities, and farm groups, turning Trump's pressure campaign into a domestic liability long before it hurt Canada. In other words, the foundation of the threat was already weakening from within the United States itself, and that erosion set the stage for Washington's next move, an effort to shift the narrative by claiming Carney had backed down, a claim that simply couldn't survive the facts that followed.
Washington attempted to claim that the Prime Minister had softened during the phone call, but the story fell apart quickly. Carney contradicted it immediately, and his account aligned with everything Canada has been signaling for months, that diversification is deliberate, lawful under USMCA, and strategically essential. McNaughton's perspective made the situation even clearer. He described both men as likely giving versions of the call that reflected their own political priorities, not objective reality. But he also pointed out something more subtle, that Trump reacted intensely to public perception, Carney receiving a standing ovation while Trump did not was enough to trigger the president's instinct to reassert dominance through narrative and threat. Once Canada refused to validate that version of events, the entire framing collapsed. And that collapse exposed something deeper than a failed talking point. It highlighted the broader pattern behind the United States' use of economic pressure, a pattern that Jeffrey Sachs has been warning about for years. His perspective helps make sense of why this confrontation unfolded the way it did.
Seen through Sachs's lens, the clash between Canada and the United States is not just a disagreement over tariffs, but part of a much wider shift in how economic power is being deployed. Jeffrey Sachs's warning about economic warfare puts the confrontation into a broader context. He argues that using tariffs as tools of coercion, untethered from legal processes or long-term strategy, undermines global stability and weakens the U.S. position. Canada's response fits precisely into that critique. Instead of absorbing the pressure, Ottawa openly challenged the legitimacy of the tactic. It emphasized compliance with USMCA, rejected the claim that it was pursuing a free trade agreement with China, and highlighted its responsibility to diversify in a world where economic power is increasingly weaponized. In doing so, Carney turned the spotlight back on Trump's strategy rather than Canada's intentions.
Trump's attempt to force Canada back into line has boomeranged. The threat of 100% tariffs failed to intimidate, failed to divide, and failed to distort the message delivered in Davos. Carney held his ground. Canada stayed the course. And what was meant as pressure has instead revealed how limited Washington's influence has become when partners refuse to bend. As the upcoming USMCA review approaches, one question now looms larger than any tariff threat. What happens when a United States that negotiates through coercion meets a Canada that has learned to negotiate from strength?